Hey, this is Brian with Webucator. In this video we're going to go through right now, I'm going to show you a solution that Joe Zim came up with for handling forms with JavaScript in the case that elements are named problematically. Joe agreed to let us create this video showing the solution he came up with, which is available as an article on his blog at the URL that I have here up on my screen. I'd encourage you to take a look through the article. I took the code here in his very excellent discussion of it and explanation and rigged up a quick example. Let's take a look. I've got a couple of very simple HTML pages, index.html and page2.html. Ignoring for just a minute the scripting at the bottom, index.html pretty much consists only of a form. On line 8, you can see the form tag. It's got an ID of form and an action of page2.html. Of course, in the absence of a method attribute, the form is going to submit via the get method rather than the post method. Fine for our purposes here. On lines 9 and 10, I have a label for and an input of type text. So on line 9, I've got a label for action 2. And notice that label says action colon. And then on line 10, I've got the input, a text input with which the label is associated. It's got a name action 2 and an ID action 2. Lastly, on line 11, I've got an input of type submit, which happens to have an ID of type submit. Very common, of course, right? And useful for us to apply IDs to these elements so that we can use JavaScript to do stuff with them, to get their values, to change their color, to show or hide them, etc. And again, in the absence of any scripting, if I actually go to the page, looks like this, right? And I can type anything in here, click submit, and it gets to page 2. You can see that the one name value pair, action 2 equals SDF, is on the URL string. I'm on page2.html. Just running this off my laptop, but that works fine here. And page 2 doesn't do anything with the form submission. All it does is say I'm page 2, blindly, willfully ignorant of any form submissions that come to it. Now, let's see what we can do with a little bit of JavaScript. Well, var form equals document.getElement by ID of form. So on line 16, I have a JavaScript variable named form, which gets the DOM object, the document object model thing that is the form. Very common. I'm not using a library like jQuery. I'm using plain old JavaScript here. And then on line 18, I could alert to the screen, pop up to the screen a JavaScript message. What is form.action? Right here we start to get into what Joe points out as these convenience methods. Right? So I can say form.action on line 18 to refer to the action attribute of the form itself. Well, that should be page2.html. So now that I have this scripting in place, if I go back to the actual form, which I did with the back button, you notice I get an alert popped up to the screen, which gives me, in this case, because that's the way Chrome works, the full unqualified address of the action attribute, right? File, users, Brian Hoke, etc., page2.html. If I refresh that page, I get the same thing. Now, take a look, though, if I name this on line 10, this input of type text, if I name it action, give it an ID of action, now what happens if I refresh it? Now the JavaScript pop-up is actually referencing the field. So I run into a problem that, as Joe points out, what if you can't control the HTML? What if, for whatever reason, you only have access to some JavaScript, say in an external file? The HTML, because of the hosting situation or your membership on a team that's distributed, you're sort of stuck. Even more importantly, if I comment that out, there's a very traditional way to be able to submit the form, right, with JavaScript. So in line 21, I've uncommented out that line, form.submit, right? So that's a JavaScript action I'm trying to take to say, let's submit the form. Of course, it wouldn't normally work like this, right? We wouldn't just submit the form right on page load. We'd probably do it in response to somebody clicking some other button, some call to a database or external resource, etc. But for right here, what should happen is that as soon as this page loads, the JavaScript on line 21 asks the form to submit, just as if the user had clicked the submit button. Let's see what happens. If I open up the console here, maybe we'll get a better answer. Oops, sorry, forgot to refresh it. All right, so now if I'm refreshing that page, notice what I get in the console. I don't actually get the form submitted, because if I did, I'd be on page 2. But notice there I get in the console this JavaScript error, form.submit is not a function. Well, again, just as we saw with the action ID name for the input, on line 11, I or somebody has ID'd the input of type submit, right? I've given it an ID of submit. So the problem is there's a confusion in JavaScript's world. On line 21, form.submit no longer works to submit the form, but rather JavaScript is thinking it's a reference to a field within the form whose ID is submit. Joe's suggestion, and it's a good one, is simply to use HTML form element.prototype.submit.call of form. Right? So a way to get around that sort of built-in convenience that browsers offer in their implementation of JavaScript to be able to submit the form. So now if I refresh the page, if I go back to the page and refresh it, it should be the scripting that actually submits the form. So I won't even see the page. I'll get right to page 2. So here, this example shows how I can call, even if I'm out of control of the IDs of the given elements within my form, and one of the IDs happens to conflict with, say, submit, like in our case on line 11, there's an element with ID submit. This statement on line 24 allows me to get around that problem. So I hope you found that useful in your work, say, on front-end development with JavaScript. I hope you found it so. And thanks again to Joe for the inspiration for this video. I'd check out his blog here at the URL that I'm showing to look through this article in more detail and to look at other articles that Joe has put up.